What's okay? I guess go ahead and get started then. So we're already a little bit behind, and since we got somebody doing the invitation, I got to get everything rolling and give Mark his time. So we're gonna, unless we really go slow, the plan is to finish the book today, tonight. We're in chapter 17 of the Psalms book, and tonight we're going to be talking about the royal Psalms, of course, which are referring to the Psalms regarding the king. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Our holy divine Father in heaven, we thank you for the day that you've given us, and we thank you for your word and for the praises that we can see in your and that have been inspired for our encouragement. The words spoken about your King, about our Lord Jesus, that you have preserved him for our use. And I pray that as we study, that we would learn more, that we would grow closer to you, that we would be encouraged in our faith, that all that we do here would glorify you. We pray all this in your Son's name. All right. So again, we're talking about Psalms of the King or the Royal Psalms. Laura suggested I put this is actually in the workbook. But if you'll notice, it's in the Museum of Jerusalem. I forget what it's called, but yeah, something like that. And this is for a long time there was some discussion about whether David was even a real person. They finally found a stone that actually has an inscription referring to the house of David. And they found a couple of other things since then. But now more and more we're starting to, again, as the more we look for things, the more we actually start finding things. And turns out, again, just because we haven't found anything doesn't mean it's not there. And now we're starting to see that, yes, there's pretty strong evidence that David was a real person. He was the king over Israel. And so that's more reason to believe what we see in scripture. Sure, sure. Yeah. Other kind. Yeah, they found apparently that whoever was the architect of David's house had a particular style, whether it was specific to David or just how he liked to do things, and they found that repeated in locations around Israel. So it's kind of interesting. So we're talking about this idea of the royal psalms and the image of a king, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit in terms of what the king meant and why having a king was such a big deal to Israel. When when you think about what the king meant to Israel, how would you describe that relationship? Why was a king important to Israel? Okay. That was one of the big reasons why they wanted a king, right? Give us a king so that we may be like the other nations, Laura. Okay. They want a physical protector. Uh, in fact, let's go to that and along with what you guys just said. If you remember, was God against the idea of Israel having a king? Well, he was their king. Look over in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Uh, Deuteronomy 17 and verse 14. God, I guess you could argue that maybe this is God accommodating what he knows is going to happen. But in verse 14, it says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you and you possess it and dwell in it, then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose, one from among your brothers. And he goes on and describes what he will do. And as you look through this, by the way, it's useful that from the first king on, pretty much everybody ignored every single thing that he puts in this passage. But regardless, God said, okay, you can have a king. And this is who he's going to be, and this is what's going to characterize him. And in verse 18 particularly, it says, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him. He shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So, what kind of a king does God want here? I mean, how would you describe the king that God is going to establish? Okay, he's a humble king. I think that's interesting that his heart would not be lifted above his brethren. Yeah, that's just not the kind of, that's not how you would look at a king in really any other. The idea that I'm no better than anybody. Of course, I'm better than everybody else. I'm the king. I'm here by divine right, which means I'm better than the people around me. That's how kings are typically looked at. Yeah, yeah. This isn't a deal where you're going to reign and this is going to be your kingdom to do with as you see fit. You're going to be reigning in the name of God, by his permission and according to his will, and that's the idea. And as I was thinking about this, oh, Mark, go ahead. Yeah. Mm, yeah. And I think there's a difference, as I was thinking about this a little bit, between what we read in Deuteronomy and what eventually happens in First Samuel. Why, if you remember, Dan already alluded to this, why do they want a king? They come to Samuel, give us a king. so that so that we can be like the other nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Just thinking about that real quick before we move on with that, you know, what does the king, not just for Israel, but what does the king represent to the people that he rules over? Leadership? I'm sorry. He listen. He should. Well, the idea that he will judge us, he's supposed to be helping us with our lives and making sure that things are being run according to the law. Yeah. What is he when he talks about going out before us as a warrior, and not just as a warrior, a military leader? Uh, when you think about, for example, the King of England right now, who has, I mean, I guess there's power, but not really. There kind of is. Why does the King of England matter at all to England? Okay, tradition. That's a big part of it, right? Yeah, but the reason that they care at all is that he is a representative of the nation. He is England. The king stands for the nation. When it talks about he will go out before us, he will represent us. When people see him, he is us. And that's why it's really important to have a king that's powerful and strong and has a big army and lots of banners and things, because we want people to be impressed by our king, because when they see the king, they see us. He is an extension of us. He's a representative of us. And so, and I think that's pretty typically why people are what a king was supposed to be, all the things that we've talked about here, that he is supposed to be our representation. He's one of us, but he's not one of us. He's yeah, he's one of our people. It's no good to have a king that's not from our nation. He's not related to us. He has no connection to our king. Now, I will say this one thing. When Samuel comes back in 1 Samuel 12 and talks to the people, the people gave a part of the answer. We want a king that will be like everybody else. Samuel says there was something else going on, though. If you remember, do you remember what that was? Well, yeah, but that wasn't the point that Samuel talks about here. Why were the people really motivated to come get a king? You remember? Samuel makes this point in 1 Samuel 12 in verse 11 when he's talking about all the things that God had done for them. And he says, and the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Barak and Jephthah and Samuel and delivered you out of the hands of your enemies on every side, and you lived in safety. And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord your God was your king. What was the thing that prompted this to begin with? Okay, but but what's Samuel saying here? What is Samuel's point here? What did they see that prompted them to come ask for a king? Okay, why would that prompt somebody to say we need a king? Okay, okay, okay. Well, why would I need? Well, the if if I'm feeling threatened by another kingdom or another army, and I go and say we need a king, the implication is that I think that having a king is going to help us to fight. And that is that accurate? Would that be reasonable? The idea here is that we need a king because Samuel cannot protect us. Samuel is a judge. Samuel is a priest. He's not really a warrior. We need somebody to go out and lead an army, and not just if you read the Judges and you remember how that book goes. Typically, what tends to happen is the judges were their stories were focused in this tribe or this area. There really weren't a lot of examples where basically the a judge stood up and the entire nation rallied to him and they became united under one banner. It was always kind of fragmented. But the idea of having a king, they're saying, look, if we just had one person that we could all rally around as a nation, we can overcome this, this army that's coming in. Mark, go ahead. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so. They needed a leader, but of course Joshua was gone. And here's the thing: what happens after Joshua's gone? Yeah, everybody kind of drifts off, and it gets back to what you were saying. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was a second aspect to that, which was the people were following. In fact, there's a line in the song that Deborah and Barak speak in Judges 5, and I have it somewhere in my notes, but basically it's something to the effect of when the king rules and the people follow willingly, or the king rules in righteousness and the people follow. In other words, when we've got a king that's doing right and we've got people that are following along in that, then the people will be blessed. That's when the nation will be truly successful. Well, and of course they didn't have a king, or I actually didn't say when the king rules. He said when rulers rule. Uh, so that idea that when the ruler is godly, when the people are following along, God's people are going to be successful. And so the idea here is that we want a king that can stand up like Joshua and lead us in battle, but we want a leader that's not just going to disappear and then we're kind of just left to wonder what's next. Why is a king better than a judge in that regard? What happens when the judge dies? What happens? Nothing. Just no succession. As opposed to a king, when the king dies, what happens? He has a son. He has a dynasty. It's not just establishing one man as king. It's establishing a line, a heritage. That's the idea that I know that the next person is going to be king, not because we had this big free for all to try to figure out who was going to win the job, but because this is divine right. We know it was God's will because He has set this up. And when I have that, I have a lot more stability in my nation, don't I? Can you imagine you got you got Judah and you got Israel, the 10 tribes. And if you remember the history of the first, what, 30 or 40 or 50 years of Israel, I don't even remember how many kings they had. By the time Judah got to its third king, I think Israel was on number 10 or something like that. Because every time somebody died, it was because somebody killed him and took over the throne. And there was no clear succession. It was just everything was up for grabs. You can't have peace in a nation like that. And so there's this idea that we want a representative, we want a leader, we want someone to fight our battles, and we want something established and stability and stable. And that's kind of the idea of wanting a king. Now, as we describe that, do you think Israel needed a king? Uh, I'm probably leading this a little bit. Because on the one hand, we would say, well, look, God says I was their king. Well, that's right. How do people typically go? How do people typically function when they don't have somebody to turn to that is the leader? That not and not just a leader, but an inspirational figure that I can look up to and aspire to, that I can admire. Do we need that generally in our lives? I kind of think we do, right? That's why everybody wants so badly to love the president, because even though the president has he doesn't have little power, but not a lot of power in our government. But we still like the idea of a president who can sit down with his pen, write an executive order, pass it off, and that just gets done. We like the idea that there's one person that can do this, and somebody that we have elected and that we look at and that we admire, which is why our politics have become so much dirtier over the last few years because we don't really elect people that we admire anymore. We just elect somebody that just knows how to play the game. But we intrinsically want to be led by somebody that is worth following. And I would suggest, I think God understood this, and I think God accommodated that. I think that's a big reason why he does set up a king. But more importantly, why God establishes an even greater king to come. Because what is Jesus to us? It's our king. And he's a king in every single way that we've talked about. The idea that we look, as Hebrews 12 talks about, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. The source of our admiration, the source of our devotion, the source of our inspiration. We look at Jesus, and here is a king that we would die for, that we would go into battle for, because we know that here is someone who is righteous and just and good and who cares about me. A lot harder to follow a king when he doesn't have any of those things. And I think that we see a lot of that as we go in and talk about the kings of Israel. And as we look at some of these Psalms and how they're described, I think Psalm 72 is really interesting. I'm taking these out of order from the book because I think 72 is a good place to start, because Psalm 72 describes in a lot of ways what makes a good king. And it's 72 verse 1, the introduction of the Psalm says of Solomon, which means it's either written for Solomon, about Solomon, or to Solomon. We're not sure. But if you read along, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people, and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, crush the oppressor. May they fear you while the sun endures, as long as the moon, throughout all generations. May he be like rain that falls in the mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his day, may the righteous flourish, and peace abound till the moon be no more. May he have dominion from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. May desert tribes bow down before him, his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and of the coastland render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all kings fall down before him, all nations serve him. For he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor with him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. Long may he live. May gold of Sheba be given to him. May prayer be made for him continually, and blessings invoked for him all the day. May there be abundance of grain in the land, on the tops of the mountains may it wave. May its fruit be like Lebanon. May people blossom in the cities like the grass of the field. May his name endure forever. His fame continue as long as the sun. May people be blessed in him. All nations call him blessed. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who alone does wondrous things. Blessed be his glorious name forever. May the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen." And you notice the last verse, verse 20, the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. And the idea, part of that, it's the end of book 2, and maybe this is signifying that this is the last of David's Psalms. But I think it's interesting that this would be the last prayer of David. The idea that this, if this was David's prayer, what's David asking for here? Okay, for God's name to be glorified. That's the last thing he ends with. But what's the bulk of the psalm about? About a good king, right? It's He's talking about this idea of, he goes through and describes what makes this king good. And when this king is good, by the way, as Laura said, when the king is good, what happens to the nation? The nation flourishes. The nation is blessed. He talks about, you know, we would, he describes that a good king is, if we've got a good king, we're going to have wheat on the mountain, and we're going to have crops, and where people are going to be, it's just going to be this wonderful thing if we have a good king. And I almost said it's kind of a unrealistic and ridiculous idea that the king would have any impact on how our crops grow. But then I realized that we believe that our president can determine how the stock market works. So, maybe this is not that uncommon at all. But the idea that we just feel like whenever we've got the right person in charge, that everything is just going to be better. And what's interesting to me about this psalm is if you were going to ask a nation in the world what makes a great king, if you can kind of put your mind back, let's say we were the Syrians, all right. What would the Syrians say would make a really good king for them? What would that king be like? Okay, well, peace and prosperity. Hmm. Yeah, that's a good king. Now, a great king might go a little beyond that, though, right? Because the great king doesn't just say, I'm going to make sure that this little part of our world is doing really well. Uh, I'm going to look over at that part and say, it'd be even better if we had their land. So we're going to go take them, and we're going to defeat their armies, and they're going to pay tribute to us, and we're going to build this empire. What nations were the proudest? The ones that had the vast empires, who had control over other nations, because we want to have we want our king to be the main king. Everybody else can be the minor kings, or I don't remember, or the kings that are basically answering to our king. Blanking on it. But the idea that we want our king to be the great one, the one that goes out and conquers the nations, that makes us all rich, that gets everything where it needs to be. What does Psalm 72 describe? What is the primary characteristic of this king that keeps coming up over and over in Psalm 72? Righteousness. And what goes along with being righteous? What does it mean to be a righteous king in this context? Justice, delivers the needy. This idea of righteousness, justice, and delivering the needy. And those three things just keep coming up throughout this idea that this is what David says a good king is going to be defined by. Not by how powerful his army is, not by how many victories he has. As verse 2, may he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. And he reiterates that over and over again. And one of the questions that the book asks is the relationship between righteousness and peace. And what is the relationship in a nation between righteousness and peace? Should be. Yeah, it is. And I will say, man, of course, this particular time in life is just insane. But I think it's fair to say that typically in history, when people have risen up and said this group of people is being oppressed, these people are impoverished, the government isn't doing anything for us. Have there been times when that's been true? Maybe times that it's true today to some degree. And to your point, typically when we have unrest in society, is it coming from all the rich people? From the people that are no, why are they? They're rich. Do whatever you want. I don't care. I'm rich. The unrest comes when people who are in need are crying out and saying, "Forgotten about me. You're not being just to me." One of the big keys to peace in any nation is if you're not just helping the people that can help themselves. You're helping the people that can't help. And that's the idea that, and that's the image I think that David brings up over and over again. This is a king that cares about his people. His people revere him and put him up on a pedestal and admire him. And he in turn loves and cares for them. And I was thinking about, even David, who was not, certainly he had his flaws. But when you think about David and his relationship with the people, how would you describe that? How would you describe David's relationship with the people? He cared about his people. Um, he didn't always. He sometimes forgot about that. But I remember, the verse that jumps out at me is back in 2 Samuel 24 when David, of course, has made one of his mistakes. He's convinced to go do a census of the people, presumably for his own pride, to see how big of how big his army is. And as a result of that, he's condemned by God for that, and he has to pick a punishment. And he makes a mistake. He says, I don't want to be pursued by my enemies, so he allows plagues to come on the land, and 70,000 people die. And when David sees this, and I suspect that he never really understood he probably didn't think that through when he made that point, because he turns around in verse 17, says the Lord, behold, I have sinned and I have done wickedly, but these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house. The good king is the one who's willing to say, you punish me for my mistakes. Don't hurt my people for this. And that's what David was willing to do. I don't know that there were very many kings after him, if any, that would have said that. And of course, what are we, what ultimately do we see here? What's this pointing towards? What are we foreshadowing here? Well, maybe I'll just, I need to, what's David a type of here? What, showing what Christ is going to do. David is acknowledging his own sin and interceding on behalf of the people. Christ does one better, of course, because Christ has no sin, and yet Christ still says, "Lay the punishment on me. I'll bear their iniquities. I will take the stripes that are due to them." And so he gives that model of who ultimately will be the true great king, who will really judge the people with righteousness. And because, as I said, how many times did this ever really get fulfilled? When we look at Israel's kings, how often were they at peace? How often how many Psalms do we read about the cry of the cry of the needy and the impoverished who are being oppressed, and asking God, when will you intervene? Because our kings aren't doing what they're supposed to do. Why does that happen? Why do earthly kings so often fail in this regard? General, yeah, but leaders in general, I guess you could say. Okay. Yeah, they have a selfish idea. They're thinking about how their power is going to enrich them, and certainly they're not unique in that regard. What else? I'm a human king. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. They oppress. Well, yeah, they do, because obviously, if they're looking for what they want to get, they're going to wring as much out of the people as they can, right? What's the limitation of a person who rules over a kingdom of 2 million people? How likely am I to see the oppression that's going on in the world? Probably not very likely, right? Yeah. Yeah. They can be isolated and they don't see. Sometimes it's not about not wanting to help the poor; it's just not knowing. I think about David, where like in his later years, he kind of was that situation, to the point where Absalom would come out to the gate and tell people, "Hey, if I were king, I'd be out here talking to you, and I'd be making sure listening to your case." and making sure that you were represented, but David doesn't care about you. Now, I always wonder if Absalom just got there early before David arrived and kind of worked that before, or if David had just maybe David had grown distant. We don't know. But sometimes it's not about oppression so much as it's just not knowing and being disconnected. Being too busy. That a lot of work to run an empire. And how easy is it to, I've got armies over there I need to deal with, and I've got two women over here arguing that one of them has stolen the other's baby. And what are you going to do about that? Are you going to make a ruling about, oh, I don't have time for this. I've got this to do. Can't you handle that? The idea of justice and righteousness sometimes gets pushed off to the side and doesn't have the urgency maybe that it sometimes ought to have. And sometimes it's just that's just beneath me. I don't need to deal with that. I'm the king and you're the peasants, and you just need to deal with your own problems. I got other things to deal with. There's a lot of reasons why earthly kings almost never live up to the ideal that we read here. And the message of that, I think, it's the same message as the Judges. The book of Judges is written basically to tell us that the judges were not up to the challenge of leading God's people. And then we get to the book of Samuel and the book of the Kings, and the theme there is that the kings weren't up to that either. Because again, they had the same limitations that we've just been talking about. And so what do we need? If God says, I need them to have a king that they can look up to that will rule them in this way, but I don't see anybody down here on the earth that's capable of doing that. What does God do? He comes down and does it himself. I will be their king. That's the message that Ezekiel gives. The Lord, I myself will be their shepherd. What a great thought that is, that God is unwilling to allow his people to be ruled by someone who can't do the job the way it needs to be done, the way God wants it to be. He's willing to do it himself. And we see Jesus being brought down to be this king. And so when we read Psalm 72 here, it's a big part of this is describing the ideal that the kings are going to aspire to and fail to live up to. And then we're going to see ultimately how all of this is fulfilled in Christ. So we see that image. Any comments, thoughts on what we talked about so far? Let's look at Psalm 2. Okay. Psalm 2. The next psalm that he wanted to look at, and of course, this one I think we're pretty familiar with. How do we know? Let's see. Let's read this. Psalm 2, verse 1. He says, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? Kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So, we have the king that's going to be established by God, who says, I established my king on Zion, my holy hill. But is this just a king over God's people? Who's being ruled over here? All the nations, right? Yeah, and of course we know who this is talking about, right? How do we know that this is talking about Jesus? Do any of these passages look familiar to us? Yeah. Yeah, that idea of the anointed, which is the word that would have been translated Christ. And of course, this could apply to any king. All the kings in David's line were the anointed of God. They were his anointed. But why do we know this isn't just talking about David? Okay, that's the first thing, because it's referenced in Acts 4. The disciples quote this passage. If you remember, that after having been persecuted and beaten in the temple, they come back and they pray out to God and they quote this passage. Why do the nations rage? The people plot in vain. The kings of earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. What are they what are they referring to here? How are they applying that all the way over in Acts chapter 4? Yeah. Mhm. Yep. Yeah, this is quite literally what's happening with Jesus, right? The kings of the world have literally, not necessarily the kings, but the leaders, both Jew and Gentile, aligning themselves against the anointed of God, and he had triumphed over them. The second one, the second passage that might be familiar is farther down in verse 7, where it says, "The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you." Uh, Romans 1, it's cited in Romans 1, verse 4. It's cited in Acts 13:3. It's cited in Hebrews on two different occasions. The idea that the Lord has said, "You are my son, today have I begotten you." And of course, when Hebrews quotes this over in Hebrews chapter 1, uh, actually Hebrews 5, Hebrews 1, yeah, Hebrews 1 is what. Actually, you know what? Let's look at Acts 13. Actually, I want Acts 13. I'm sorry, Acts 13. Acts 13:33. This is the one that specifically makes the application. Um, and if you go to Acts 13 and back up to verse 30, where it says, God raised him from the dead, and for many days he appeared to those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. And we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus, as also it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. When Peter says this, or Paul says this, I should say, what is he referring to when he quotes the Psalm, today I have begotten you? How is he applying that phrase? When, for the resurrection. He's saying, this day I have begotten you. By raising you from the dead, I've shown you to be my son through the resurrection from the dead. Uh, so we know that Psalm 2, that's what we're talking about here. We're ultimately talking about Christ, who sits in, who's come because God has put him on this throne. He has exalted him. And the idea that the warning to the kings of the world is what? Who's in charge? It's the Son. Worship the Son who's been put on this throne because he has the power. The question that's in the book in the back, it asks the question, what do we mean when we say King of Kings? What does the phrase King of Kings mean to us? What does that typically imply? I was thinking of a couple of ways you could probably interpret it. Okay, the only king. Okay, that's one way to look at it. He is the only king. How else might we think about that? Best of the best. He is the preeminent king among all the kings. The only king that really matters of all these other kings. This is the one. What else? Maybe the most literal interpretation of that. Best of the best. That's what Laura just said. Well, think about it this way. If I'm king over people, who am I ruling over? People. If I'm king of kings, who am I ruling over? Kings. The idea that there's all these kings, but this king is ruling over those kings. All those are kind of saying essentially the same thing, but there's different ways to look at it. And so the idea that this is a king that's going to be set up, that's not just going to be Israel's king, and we'll see this in a couple of the other Psalms as we get into it later, and I know we're not going to be able to get now because we're about out of time. But the idea here is that this is a king that's going to be exalted not just above Israel, but above all the world. But he's going to be a king that rules, as Psalm 72 does, as Psalm 72 says, in righteousness, in goodness, in justice, in mercy. When we think about what it's going to be like to be a subject in that kingdom, what it is like to be a subject in that kingdom. This is not, like I mentioned, the song that's sung back in Judges 5. Rulers rule well, and the people give themselves willingly. But we'll see another psalm later on that's going to describe that, what it's going to be like to be in the kingdom of the Lord. This is not going to be a subservient situation. This is not going to be where people are going to have to be browbeaten into serving God. It's going to be a joyful situation. Anyway, we'll stop there, and we'll go ahead and pick up then not next Wednesday. We got our singing next Wednesday. We'll be in West Side for the and then following Wednesday, then we'll finish up chapter lesson 17 and then go on to the epistles, not the epistles, but the journeys of Paul. All right, we'll stop there.